We'll now start the first panel discussion on recognition, building strong frameworks to promote equality, non-discrimination, and social harmony in the Asia-Pacific region. I invite my colleague, Mr. Rory Mungoven, to moderate the first part of this panel discussion. Mr. Mungoven is the Chief of the Asia-Pacific section at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. He previously served as country representative for ILO in Myanmar and as Senior Human Rights Advisor with the Resident Coordinator's Office in Sri Lanka during the peace process and post-tsunami response. Prior to joining the UN system in 2004, Mr. Mungoven worked as an Australian diplomat and served in leadership roles in international non-governmental organizations and the International Coalition to Stop the Use of Child Soldiers. Mr. Mungoven, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Chairperson Aziz, and thank you everybody, distinguished panelists and participants this morning. It's a great privilege for me to moderate this first panel discussion under the pillar of recognition, which will focus on the legal, institutional and policy frameworks to promote equality, non-discrimination, inclusion, tolerance and social harmony in Asia and the Pacific region. It will provide an overview of the international anti-racism framework and take stock of national and regional measures in place in the region, including education, awareness raising, and information gathering. And we hope it will further identify opportunities for strengthening existing frameworks at the national and regional level. We're joined this morning by a distinguished panel in presence and online. And so for the first part of this discussion, I would very much like to welcome and introduce them individually. Dr. Chinsung Chung of the UN Committee for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination is an Emeritus Professor at Seoul National University and holds a doctorate in sociology from the University of Chicago. She has published several books and papers on social movements in Japan, Japanese military sexual slavery, and the human rights situations in Korea and Japan. She is president of the Korean Association of Human Rights Studies and has served as president of the Korean Association of Women's Studies and of the Korean Sociological Association. Dr. Chung served as a member of the UN Subcommission on the Promotion and Protection of Human Rights and of the UN Human Rights Council Advisory Committee. I will introduce the other panelists that will be joining us and then give the floor to Dr. Chung. Ms. Barbara Reynolds is the chair of the United Nations Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent. Ms. Reynolds is the Vice President for Administration, Advancement and Planning at the University of Southern Caribbean in Trinidad and Tobago. She served as Deputy Vice Chancellor at the University of Guyana and was Head of Education for Save the Children UK, having spent the previous 2 decades with UNICEF. She holds a doctorate in international education, development, curriculum and instruction from Columbia University and a master's in international human rights law from the University of Oxford. Our third panelist will be Ms. Sara Arriola, who is the Regional Director for Asia and the Pacific of the International Organization of Migration and Coordinator of the Regional United Nations Network on Migration. Prior to joining the IOM, Ms. Arriola, was the Undersecretary for Migrant Workers Affairs of the Department of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of the Philippines, and she was the Philippines' chief negotiator for the Global Compact on Migration. The next panelist will be Emeritus Professor Rosalind Croucher, who is President of the Australian Human Rights Commission. Prior to this mandate, she worked for 10 years at the Australian Law Reform Commission. She was Dean of Law at Macquarie University and Interim Dean at Sydney Law School, and she has lectured and published extensively, principally in the fields of property, equity, and legal history, and increasingly in public policy. She holds a doctorate in legal history from the University of New South Wales and is Emeritus Professor at Macquarie University, a member of the Order of Australia. Our final panelist this morning will be Ms. Megumi Komori, who is Acting Secretary-General of the International Movement Against All Forms of Discrimination and Racism. In this role, she works for the advocacy, networking, program development, coordination for the elimination of discrimination at national, regional, and international levels. She's also a member of the Board of Directors of the International Dalit Solidarity Network. So a very distinguished and rich panel. We look forward to their presentations. It gives me great pleasure, therefore, to give the floor first to Dr. Chinsung Chung. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. Excellencies, distinguished panelists, dear participants, I'm pleased to participate in this regional meeting for Asia Pacific on the International Decade for People of African Descent on behalf of the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. I would like to thank the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights for organizing this regional meeting and for the invitation to participate in this interesting panel. The Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination is the primary international instrument specifying the measures state parties agreed to undertake to prevent and eliminate racial discrimination on the ground of race, color, descent, and national or ethnic origin, and to promote racial equality. It provides a framework for state parties to prevent racial discrimination, including by developing and reviewing laws and policies. It also includes obligations for state parties to prohibit and condemn all propaganda and all organizations which are based on ideas or theories of superiority of one race or group of persons of one color or ethnic origin. The Convention also fosters social cohesion and inclusion by requesting state parties to guarantee the right of everyone to equality before the law and in the enjoyment of all civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights. Furthermore, state parties are obliged to adopt immediate and effective measures, particularly in the fields of teaching, education, and culture, to combat prejudices that lead to racial discrimination and promote understanding, tolerance, and friendship among nations and racial or ethnic groups. As of December 2023, the Convention has been ratified by 182 states, making it one of the most widely ratified human rights treaties in the world. However, the non-ratification rate is high in the Asia-Pacific regions with 12 states. I would like to invite these 12 states in the regions to consider the ratification of the Convention as a critical step toward upholding the principles of equality and non-discrimination. Furthermore, the development of a regional human rights system and mechanisms for the Asia-Pacific regions would strengthen the prevention of racial discrimination with regional considerations such as shared regional customs, values, culture, and practices and geopolitical and economic conditions. The committee dedicates particular attention to the situation of people of African descent to ensure they shall enjoy all human rights and fundamental freedoms in accordance with international standards in conditions of equality and without any discrimination. Even though the number of people of African descent is relatively smaller in this region, there has been significant influx of refugees and students from Africa, and economic, political, and cultural relationships with African countries has become more important. Thus, countries in this region should be more sensitive to negative stereotype of African people. Country reviews by the committee show that people of African descent continue to experience racial discrimination. General recommendation number 34 in 2011 on racial discrimination against people of African descent provides an authoritative interpretation of the Convention's provisions and their application, including targeted and detailed recommendations to state parties for the exercise of the right of people of African descent and the elimination of racial discrimination. The committee recommends that state parties adopt a series of measures, including special measures, affirmative action, and comprehensive national strategies with the participation of people of African descent to eliminate discrimination against people of African descent and ensure their full enjoyment of all human rights and fundamental freedoms. It also recommends to review and enact or amend legislation to eliminate all forms of racial discrimination against people of African descent and to fully implement legislation and other measures already in place. It also addresses intersectionality, including gender-related dimensions of racial discrimination, protection against hate speech and racial violence, administration of justice, and measures in the field of education. While considering the report of state parties in the Asia-Pacific regions, in addition to monitoring compliance with General Recommendation number 34, the committee has also systematically inquired about the status of implementation of the program of activities for the International Decade for People of African Descent and recommended state parties to prepare and implement a suitable program of measures and policies in this regard. Furthermore, during the consideration of state parties from the reasons of the committee identified the committee identified positive measures by states regarding the situation people of African descent, which can take the form of adopting a new legislation or policy to ensure the enjoyment of people of African descent of all their civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights without discrimination. Examples include the adoption of the National Anti-Racism Strategy in Australia, the establishment of refugee law and Korea-Africa Foundation in South Korea, and the adoption of the action on the promotion of effort to eliminate unfair discriminatory speech and behavior against persons originating from outside Japan during last 10 years. In addition to positive aspects, the committee highlighted areas where the state parties need to enhance their legal and police measures regarding the situation of people of African descent. I will share a summary of identified common challenges regarding the situation of people of African descent in state parties from the Asia-Pacific regions. First, disaggregated data. The committee noted with concern the lack of comprehensive disaggregated data on the demographic composition of the population, disaggregated by color, descent, and ethnic or national origin. The lack of data limits the committee's ability to properly assess the situation of people of African descent and monitor the impact of legislative and police measures implemented by the state parties to prevent racial discrimination. Legal framework on racial discrimination. For several state parties in Asia Pacific, the committee expressed concerns that the national legislative framework does not contain an explicit definition of racial discrimination on all grounds enumerated in Article 1 of the Convention, particularly on the ground of color, descent, or national or ethnic origin, and that it does not expressly prohibit both direct and indirect racial discrimination in the public and private spheres. For instance, during the dialogue with one state party, the committee raised concern about report that non-citizens, including people of African descent, are denied housing, employment, and entry to and services of certain privately owned facilities like hotels and restaurants because they are foreign nationals. The committee frequently recommends state parties to consider developing a comprehensive anti-discrimination legislation. The complaint of racial discrimination. The committee also noted the lack of information and statistics on complaints of racial discrimination filed with the national courts and other relevant institutions, including by people of African descent, as well as on investigation, prosecutions, convictions, sanctions, and the reparations provided to victims. This prevents the committee to obtain an overview on access to justice by victims of racial discrimination, particularly people of African descent. Hate speech and hate crime. The committee noticed in several states the rise of expression of racism, racial discrimination, and xenophobia impacting people of African descent, including in the public sphere, in political debate, and in the media. This is associated with the fact that in several state parties in the region, the legislative framework does not contain provisions that expressly criminalize racist hate speech and hate crimes in accordance with Article 4 of the Convention. The committee is also concerned about the inadequacy or even absence of effort and measures taken to monitor the spread of hate speech on the internet and social media. Then racial profiling and racially motivated policy violence. The committee constantly monitors the measures taken by state parties to prevent and combat racial profiling by law enforcement officers following the adoption of its General Recommendation number 36 in 2020. In this regard, the committee expressly concerned regarding the lack of clear prohibition of racial profiling in the legislative framework on law enforcement in the majority of states in the regions, and the lack of information on measures taken to combat racial profiling and racially motivated police violence, particularly against non-citizens. Refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants. The committee raised concern in the reasons regarding the situation of refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants, particularly people of African descent. These concerns are related to detention of asylum seekers for indefinite period and various accessing education and social welfare. In one state, the committee raised concerns about reports on different treatment in the resettlement of refugees from certain regions as opposed to others. Another concern in a different state party was the policy of transferring migrants and asylum seekers arriving by boat and without visas to the regional processing centers for the processing of their claims, despite the high number of corroborated reports on the desperate and dangerous conditions prevailing in those centers. Human rights education to combat prejudice and intolerance. The committee emphasized the importance of providing human rights education at all levels to promote understanding and tolerance. History education on colonialism and enslavement is also importantly recommended. It also called upon state parties to conduct awareness-raising campaigns targeting the general public, civil servants, law enforcement officers, and judicial authorities on the importance of ethnic and cultural diversity, tolerance, and understanding. Excellencies, to conclude, on behalf of the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, I would like to reiterate the importance of implementation of international human rights obligations to eliminate discrimination against people of African descent and ensure their full enjoyment of all human rights and fundamental freedoms. I call upon all states, regional bodies, UN agencies, national human rights institutions, civil society organizations, experts, and academics to continue to engage with the committee, including by submitting information for the review of state parties' reports, and contributing to the adoption of 2 draft general recommendations of importance to people of African descent. Number 37, on racial discrimination in the enjoyment of the right to health, and joint general recommendations with the Committee on the Protection of the Rights of all Migrant Workers and members of their families on the obligation of state parties on public policies for addressing and eradicating xenophobia and its impact on the rights of migrants, their families, and other non-citizens affected by racial discrimination, and the early warning and urgent action procedures. We look forward to working together to prevent racial discrimination and to protect the human rights of people of African descent in Asia Pacific and worldwide. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Chung, for your presentation, for reminding us of the underlying importance of the convention and of General Comment 34 for this discussion, and some of the patterns and trends that the committee has identified in its review of member states from this region, as well as highlighting the nexus with refugee and migration issues. Thank you very much, Professor. I would now like to invite Ms. Barbara Reynolds, the chair of the United Nations Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent, to take the floor. Ms. Reynolds will be joining us online. You have the floor. Thank you.
Mr. Moderator, thank you very much. Chairperson, greetings, excellencies, participants, fellow travelers. Today in the US, they mark Martin Luther King Jr. Day. I'm reminded of the significance of his work while we juxtapose that with the treatment that continues to be meted out to people of African descent around the world. This regional meeting offers an occasion to raise awareness among populations and countries in Asia, where often people of African descent and the discrimination they face seem to be invisible and inaudible, not only in practice, but in law. This brings me to talk about recognition. At the outset, I think we should all agree that no part of the world is free of racism and racial discrimination. However, For many, it is inconceivable that one should even refer to people of African descent in the Asia-Pacific region. For others, it is an oxymoron. A few months ago, I was speaking to someone from Asia about the situation of people of African descent in that country. If the issue were not grave, the reaction I elicited would have been hilarious. There was outrage mixed with disbelief and packaged in disdain that one might even think about people of African descent in that country. I was told that there are, quote unquote, none of those people in that country, though there are instances that pop up when a citizen of that country marries a Black person and returns home. Setting aside the othering inherent in this statement is the widespread belief that not only are there no people of African descent in Asia, but that there should not be any either. In fact, contrary to the widely held assumption that people of African descent are recent students and traders in the region, and I might add refugees, with a few entertainers mixed in, people of African descent have been in Asia for more than 1,000 years, mainly in India, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. Such as the cities and the Kafirs, they occupy some of the lowest rungs of South Asian society, remaining distinct physically and socially, even when they have adopted their host country's religion, names, and practices. More latterly, over the last century or so, African migrants seeking work and or trade have settled in Asia. Relatively small numbers compared with the host communities, these people of African descent also live in the margins of their communities. They are in, but not of, their communities. By the second half of the 20th century, the numbers and the status of people of African descent in the Asia-Pacific swelled with the influx of university students, particularly graduate students. Nowhere in the world is the situation of people of African descent so dismissed. This attitude of ignoring their presence might be explained by many factors, among which are ignorance, lack of knowledge or teaching and awareness raising about people of African descent and their history. It might also be explained by the belief that people of African descent have made their roots in societies in which they live, and therefore deserve no specific attention as far as their situation is concerned. This attitude, however, has several significant consequences and adverse impact, perpetuating racial, deeply rooted discrimination and leaving people of African descent behind. These consequences are the tacit, widespread dismissal of the idea there are, or even could be, people of African descent in Asia renders them invisible and voiceless. 2, they are disenfranchised and disadvantaged at all levels of society. 3, their development is arrested, if not suspended. And 4, and most importantly, their rights are violated and their basic needs remain unmet. To quote the DPPA, paragraph 33, it is essential for all countries in the region of the Americas and all other areas of the African diaspora to recognize the existence of their population of African descent and the cultural, economic, political, and scientific contribution made by that population, and recognize the persistence of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerances that specifically affect them, and recognize that in many countries, their long-standing inequality in terms of access to education, health, housing has been a profound cause of the socioeconomic disparities that affect them. Of course, this is not limited to economic, social, and cultural rights, but also civil and political rights. At the center of this, ladies and gentlemen, recognition plays an important role as it is a cornerstone for all the full enjoyment of all rights and respect for the dignity to which people of African descent are entitled, as it is about the human rights and fundamental freedoms belonging to all human beings. The International Decade of People of African Descent sought through advocacy and activism to increase attention to and mobilize positive measures to secure recognition, development, and justice. The decade was supposed to provide a time pathway to rapidly increase attention to and support for the recognition, development, and justice of people of African descent. The fact that the Asia-Pacific meeting of the decade is taking place in the final year of the decade in Geneva is in and of itself a remarkable indication of the situation of people of African descent in the region. The recognition pillar of the International Decade is foundational to the achievement of justice and development. To paraphrase the famous statement attributed to Einstein, not everyone that counts is counted. Recognition of people of African descent is the essential first step to the respect for and fulfillment of their rights. And this presentation will focus on 4 key aspects. Firstly, recognition is and must be grounded in legislation and legal frameworks at national and subnational levels, as this sets the basis for the legal protection of the rights of people of African descent against discrimination, which they can claim as rights holders and move from marginalization into full integration in all areas of society on an equal footing with the rest of the population. The outcome of the recognition pillar should be the visibility and the active voice of people of African descent across all aspects of political, civic, economic, social, and cultural life at community and national levels. Secondly, recognition encompasses the respectful and accurate representation of the history and culture of people of African descent, their role in societal development, and their contribution to all aspects of being, knowing, doing, and living together. In this regard, inclusion of people of African descent and their cultures in the curricula of primary and secondary schools, the maintenance and introduction or revitalization of African studies programs at university level, and research by people of African descent on their own issues are of paramount importance. As the working group highlights in its occupational guidelines for the inclusion of people of African descent in the 2030 agenda, education has a critical role in mental liberation and symbolic decolonization, ensuring that the accuracy of history in teaching materials could help avoid stereotyping, which may lead to reducing racism and racial discrimination, and promote understanding, acceptance, and more inclusion of people of African descent in societies in which they live. Ladies and gentlemen, you might note that I've excluded the word tolerance from this string. There's nothing worse than being tolerated as a person of African descent. And I choose, therefore, to always use the word acceptance. Tolerance is not the opposite of intolerance in this context. Thirdly, recognition through legislation and legal instruments triggers the need for up-to-date, relevant policies, programs, procedures, and processes, and the concomitant budgetary provision, high-level attention, and diverse expertise. To achieve this fully, as the previous speaker underlined, data collection disaggregated by race is required, and censuses ought to include modules that elicit accurate and relevant information about the presence of people of African descent in the Asia-Pacific region. Adequate budgetary provisions and funding are essential to the provision of accessible basic goods and services. As the working group outlined in its operational guidance, without disaggregated data, gaps and failures in protection will not be recognized or be recognizable, and may even result in widening the gap between people of African descent and others in the enjoyment of their rights. Research has shown, ladies and gentlemen, that it is at this level, the question of legislation and policies and procedures and programs and processes, that structural and systemic racism take root. Thus, in advocating for recognition of people of African descent, care has to be taken to prevent the entry of unconscious bias in personnel, discriminatory structures, processes, and procedures. And I'm just going to go ahead and add here algorithms and formulae. Fourthly, recognition encompasses the acceptance and representation of the issues, concerns, and challenges of people of African descent in governance and in governmental decision-making, as well as their participation in public and political affairs without discrimination or tokenism. This means that people of African descent should be involved in decisions concerning them, and in situations where no person of African descent is present in the room or the forum or the committee, the representation of their issues and concerns at every level should be embedded in the collective consciousness, practices, and procedures in all societies. Likewise, people of African descent must participate in their community and national life in all spheres and in all levels, even and particularly when the issues are not focused on people of African descent, but on matters of importance to the community and the nation. Black scientists and educators and thinkers should be engaged in such matters, not because they are Black or the matter is directly related to the Black community, but because their expertise and experience are recognized and valued. In the matter of recognition, media professionals, traditional and contemporary social media, have an indispensable role to play. The portrayal of people of African descent, their issues and concerns, their contribution, and their lives influences how people of African descent are perceived and helps share perspectives on how they should engage or not in all aspects of life. The ethical dimensions of media portrayal merit reflection and intentional efforts to portray people of African descent accurately, honestly, and respectfully. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, there is emerging a global discourse, an argument, if you will, that equality of opportunity must not be eclipsed by the pursuit of equality of outcome. This is a dangerous argument that goes against principles of fairness, of equity, of inclusion, and diversity. Equality of opportunity is just a first step and the fundamental principle for which we have all fought and will continue to fight. However, equality of opportunity does not remove, but rather reinforces inequalities that are historical, cumulative, systemic, and structural. Thus, the pursuit of equality of outcomes is equally important. Equality does not mean identical or same. It's important to reiterate this when we address this matter. The pursuit of equality of outcomes identifies and dismantles prejudice, bias, and discrimination. It reverses their impact and affirms the equality of all people. Ultimately, equality of opportunity and the pursuit of equal outcomes are the express recognition of the inherent equality of all human beings, without which the pursuit of development and justice is performative, superficial, platitudinous, as 70 years of independence have taught us. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Chairperson, moderator, my fellow panelists, these are the aspects of recognition to which I wanted to draw your attention today. I would urge leaders and citizens of the Asia-Pacific countries to be aware and intentional in efforts to address the situation of people of African descent in the region, to recognize and respect their presence and their contribution to their societies. To achieve this integration requires political intentionality in accordance with the implementation of non-discrimination obligations most of Asia-Pacific have undertaken, including under the International Convention on the Elimination of all forms of racial discrimination. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Reynolds, especially for unpacking this this important topic of recognition in terms of legal framework, recognition in terms of history and culture, recognition in terms of policy and programming and data, and of course representation in governance. If I may, because we've added one panelist to this morning's session, if I could remind the panelists to try and keep their presentations to 15 minutes, just so we can accommodate all of the contributions this morning. Of course, this item will continue again in the afternoon, but it gives me great pleasure to invite our next panelist, Ms. Sara Arriola, who is the Regional Director for Asia Pacific of the International Organization for Migration. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator, Excellencies, distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon from Bangkok. Thank you for your invitation, and it is a pleasure for me to be here today to talk about recognition, building strong frameworks to promote equality, non-discrimination, and social harmony in the Asia-Pacific region. This meeting comes at a time when we have just launched the IOM Global Strategic Plan for 2024-2028. And the issues being addressed in this conference are salient in advancing solutions that assist member states to effectively manage migration. Indeed, we face several challenges, but IOM is committed to saving lives and protecting people on the move, driving solutions to displacement, and facilitating pathways for regular migration. Non-discrimination is embedded in the SDGs, reflecting a holistic and interconnected approach. The 2030 Agenda not only addresses the immediate challenges faced by migrants, but also seeks to create a supportive framework that promotes equal opportunities, non-discriminatory policies, and cultural diversity, aligning with a broader vision of sustainable development. We can see this across several SDGs, such as SDG 10.7, that emphasizes the significance of international cooperation in achieving safe and orderly migration. This reflects a commitment to create environments that mitigate discrimination by fostering fair and regulated migration processes. SDGs 4.7, 10.3, and 16.7 collectively highlight the significance of cultural diversity, non-discrimination, and violence prevention. By incorporating these elements into the SDGs, there is a recognition that fostering inclusive societies involves respecting cultural diversity and actively working to prevent discrimination and violence. However, the current global landscape is marked by geopolitical uncertainties and anticipated challenges due to demographic, structural, and systematic issues, as well as the convergence of deteriorating economic conditions attributed to challenging security concerns and the climate crisis. Moreover, the challenges of disinformation and misinformation against migration and migrants are on an all-time high. Hate speech abounds. A record number of global elections in 2024 could worsen political polarization and trigger instability, especially as contentious political debates on migration come to the fore. As the Asia-Pacific region confronts imminent demographic changes, the significance of tackling labor shortages has elevated migration to a vital role in fulfilling the region's long-standing economic and developmental aspirations. While I do not profess to predict the future, I acknowledge the importance of anticipating potential opportunities and challenges that lie ahead. It is crucial to navigate these obstacles thoughtfully and chart a course that upholds inclusivity and address the deep-rooted biases affecting various communities in the region. Therefore, in addressing anti-discrimination in the Asia-Pacific region, it is imperative to recognize that achieving equality and social cohesion cannot rely solely on legislation. While it is said that laws reflect the aspirations of peoples, laws are also supposed to be corrective measures to right the wrong and to remedy historical injustices, but laws are never enough. We need whole-of-government and whole-of-society approaches to address discrimination, xenophobia, and racism. It necessitates a comprehensive commitment for policymakers, businesses, educators, and community organizations to collaboratively combat racist attitudes and subtle discriminatory practices. Unconscious bias is an entrenched form of often imperceptible racism, which perpetuates systemic barriers hindering the full participation of certain racial and ethnic groups in society, and it acts as a barrier comparable to the cultural glass ceiling. Like the ongoing struggle against the gender glass ceiling, this phenomenon inhibits the progress of marginalized communities. When talking about inclusion, the understanding of who is a migrant is often broader and extends to migrants' descendants born in the receiving country. This now even centers on ethnicity. Although they have not migrated themselves, migrants' descendants may still be perceived as migrants by the receiving society and self identify as such. Migrants' inclusion within the national policies can manifest in diverse forms tailored to the values and principles of each specific country. The predominant models of inclusion adopted by various nations include assimilation, multiculturalism, and integration, each framing how the process of inclusion is conceptualized and executed within a particular societal context. According to the 2022 revision of World Population Prospects, prepared by Population Division of the Department of Economic and Social Affairs, the UN Secretariat, more than half of the projected increase in the global population up to 2050 will be concentrated in 8 countries. 5 of these countries are in Africa. It suggests that in 61 countries or areas, population expected to decrease by at least 1% over the next 3 decades because of the sustained low levels of fertility and, in some cases, elevated rates of immigration. Insights from the report show that since the 1980s, sub-Saharan Africa has been the region with the fastest growing population. According to the World Migration Report, the latest mobility trends from the same period reveal the number of Africans that have migrated within Africa has been growing steadily from around 17 million in 2015 to over 19.5 million in 2020. It is important to recognize that the narrative of African migration has often been misunderstood, leading to reactionary policies that do not comport with the realities. Indeed, African migration has been a long-standing phenomenon, and current trends suggest that this movement is poised to go further, even from the ongoing mobility patterns observed. Africans migrate in pursuit of better opportunities and at times safety and security. Their migration often yields benefits not only for themselves, but also for their families, communities, and consequently their home nations. Expanding on our ongoing initiatives, IAM has taken significant strides to proactively combat xenophobia and hate speech across online platforms, advocate for the use of evidence-based and stigma-free language in all communication channels, fostering respect and empowerment of individuals, and enhance whole of community strategies aimed at diminishing prejudice and fostering social cohesion. Moreover, IAM's diversity, inclusion, and social cohesion, or the DIS initiative, represents a dynamic, demand-driven, and multi-phase endeavor designed to bolster IAM's capacities and initiatives in fostering social cohesion, migrant integration, and inclusion. This initiative serves as a global platform facilitating knowledge exchange, learning, innovation, and the implementation of innovative strategies in these key areas. It also aims to strengthen legislative and policy frameworks to counter hate crimes, ensuring their effective implementation and enhancing access to remedies. Aligned with IOM social inclusion endeavors, we recognize the pivotal role of early personalized training and information provision in empowering migrants for successful integration. Our focus lies in imparting crucial insights about the destination country while identifying and nurturing the necessary skills for migrants to thrive, be it in their workplace or within their new communities. Integration, as we perceive it, forms a fundamental aspect of comprehensive migration management, fostering social inclusion and harmonious relationships among diverse groups, thereby contributing to the creation of diverse and yet cohesive societies. To translate this version into reality, IOM extends technical and thematic support to stakeholders and beneficiaries through various capacity building initiatives, including trainings, workshops, and advisory services. Leveraging our wealth of integration models and field experience, we aim to provide comprehensive support. Our aim is aligned with the 10T30 Agenda on Sustainable Development and the Global Compact for Safe and Orderly Migration, emphasizing on whole of society and whole of government strategy. This strategy covers crucial stages of the migration journey spanning from pre-departure, post-arrival activities, inclusive of migration inclusion, and social cohesion interventions. Our goal is to maximize effectiveness and benefit diverse populations. In the Asia-Pacific region, our interventions primarily focus on equipping migrants with essential information about their destination country. We provide tailored training programs that emphasize managing expectations, cultural orientation, and the development of skills and awareness crucial for seamless adaptation to work to new society. These initiatives encompass technical and language training aiming to facilitate migrants' integration into the labor market. We execute skills assessment, profiling, and job matching, while also enabling financial exclusion. Moreover, our effort extends to support aspirant migrants, in particular in vocational apprenticeships, generating employment opportunities in the process. As we proceed with the second regional review of the Global Compact for Migration implementation, I will urge all member states, and indeed the UN system, to work collectively to facilitate migration in line with Target 10.7 of the SDG 10, as well as GCM objectives and principles. The Global Compact for Migration significantly contributes to laying the groundwork for the rise and empowerment of migrants, serving as a pivotal framework to foster inclusivity. Emphasizing the importance of all stakeholders, collaborative frameworks involving the UN and civil society partners are essential to achieve the desired impact in advancing anti-discrimination initiatives. I would like to specifically reference GCM Objective 16, which call on member states to promote the development and inclusive and harmonious societies through empowering migrants and facilitating their active integration into society. In conclusion, IOM remains steadfast in advancing this agenda, recognizing the challenges ahead and the ongoing journey. Our approach prioritizes enduring, rights-based strategies that empower all migrants, especially those among communities who are most susceptible to exclusion, ensuring their full participation in society. Our commitment stands firm, leaving no one behind. Thank you very much for your time and indulgence.
Thank you very much, Ms. Arriola, and thank you for linking our discussion to the wider Sustainable Development Agenda and, of course, the Global Compact for Migration. It gives me pleasure now to turn for a perspective from a national human rights institution and to invite Emeritus Professor Rosalind Croucher, the President of the Australian Human Rights Commission, to take the floor.
Thank you, Rory, our excellent moderator, for this particular discussion. And I thank the excellent panel speakers. It's wonderful to listen to contributions before you speak, to hear the really great insights that my colleagues as panelists have provided. It's also lovely to see and hear the participation of a number of Australians, including yourself, Mr. Mungoven, as our moderator, and particularly Ms. Chewat of our Western Australian Parliament before, and one of the interventions from the floor. In this discussion, I want to provide the perspective of a national human rights institution and provide some examples from Australia under the concept of recognition through law and policy frameworks. Ms. Reynolds spoke beautifully of the issues of invisibility and inaudibility. The concept of recognition addresses both the seeing and the hearing. Before I begin, though, I want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm joining you. It's customary in Australia, and I am on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And I want to extend respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who might be joining us today, and to express my gratitude for the legacies and leadership of African peoples and people of African descent in anti-racism efforts around the world. The reference to Martin Luther King Jr. was a timely one, I think. And I also extend respect to any people of African descent who are attending in this wonderful session. A national human rights institution, our core function is to promote and monitor the access and enjoyment of human rights in the nations of which we are the NHRI, and to advance this both domestically and on a global scale. To be internationally recognised, NHRIs have to comply with standards and responsibilities that are set out in principles endorsed by the UN General Assembly in 1993, the Paris Principles as they're known. And with particular relevance to our conversation this morning is the principle that requires NHRIs to publicise human rights and efforts to combat all forms of discrimination, in particular racial discrimination, by increasing public awareness, especially through information and education. That idea of increasing public awareness goes to part of the problem about invisibility and inaudibility that Ms. Reynolds addressed. NHRIs have an obligation, even within the concept of us as a national human rights institution, to make visible and to give voice to those whose human rights are affected. And in addition, we have part of our legislative structure and our status is to have a statutory mandate where such matters are addressed. So that idea of public awareness through information and education anchored in a legislative mandate is central to the work of the Australian Human Rights Commission. And I will give you some examples shortly. But part of our core functions as set out in our own legislation, we are required to promote an understanding of and compliance with the Racial Discrimination Act, one of the key pieces of legislation in our domestic framing of human rights protections. And it promotes equality between people of different backgrounds and protects people from unfair treatment or vilification on the basis of race, colour, descent, or national or ethnic origin. It is Australia's domestic implementation of the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, and it was the first piece in our Australian legislative suite of protections implementing our international obligations. So combating racial discrimination and promoting racial equality is a key function of the Australian Human Rights Commission, of which I am the agency head or president. We also have a dedicated race discrimination team led by a race discrimination commissioner. At the moment, there is a hiatus or a gap in the appointment of the Race Discrimination Commissioner. So I have the honour of carrying the hat of the Race Discrimination Commissioner for about another month as well. But across our anti-racism work, we aim to put at the centre the experiences of negatively racialised individuals and communities, and also to amplify community solutions. That idea of giving voice, of making audible the inaudible, must be anchored in the voices of the communities that are affected. And that is a key focus of our work. The context in Australia in terms of people of African descent, in our census in 2021, it showed that approximately 1.6%, or just under 500,000 people in Australia, identified as being of African ancestry, noting that these figures may indeed be an underrepresentation because race data is not consistently and adequately collected, a problem that other speakers have alluded to. The working group of experts on people of African descent in their report in September 2023 identified a range of problems of interpersonal racism in Australia that can lead to racial disparities, which are also evident in many other countries. But the working group's report was informed by the findings of the Australian Human Rights Commission's scoping consultations to progress a national anti-racism framework. the consultations identified issues experienced by African communities and people of African descent in Australia and priority responses. So the idea of advancing that awareness and working towards solutions grounded in community voices is absolutely central to the work of the Australian Human Rights Commission. And I thank Professor Chung for referring to Australia's work on anti-racism. The National Anti-Racism Framework is a key focus and a core project of the Commission. It will aim to support the commitment of government, civil society, businesses, and the community to tackle racism and promote racial equality across Australia. We released a proposal for the framework in March 2021 in response to ongoing community calls for national action and heightened experiences of racial discrimination and inequity during COVID-19. We listened to community and sought to do something about it. We then consulted with peak and community organisations, experts, service providers, human rights agencies, and government at all levels to inform the scope and vision for the framework through a community-led approach. The consultations for the framework, which were conducted from over a year, really, between from March 2021 through to April 2022, the consultations identified several issues that were specific to African Australians and those of African descent, which were published in the framework's recent scoping report. And I thought I would highlight those issues for the purposes of our conversation. The issues that were identified went to media representation, harmful public narratives, racialized policing, a lack of comprehensive data, and challenges across education, employment, and access to services. I'll briefly comment about each. Media representation. Media reporting about African Australian communities is often biased and prejudicial. And this is amplified in situations where there is an intersection, as there is in many of these situations, with religion, particularly in African Australian Muslim communities. Social media has also proven to be an unsafe space for African Australians. The second is leadership narratives. And the consultations revealed that political and leader statements can be deficit-based and perpetuate stereotypes and prejudices. They're also often intertwined with media narratives, with negative portrayals, similarly amplified when it intersects with religion. The third is policing. Young African Australians, particularly young men, experience disproportionate levels of policing and disproportionate policing responses when they interact with the police. And this too can then loop into media representation and leadership narratives grounded in prejudices, particularly focusing, one I recalled very strongly was a very prejudiced and biased representation of groups of young African men as somehow gangs of bad people. It was a very, very perverse narrative. The next element was data, and this has been mentioned, the lack of comprehensive national data on the prevalence and impacts of racism was highlighted through our consultations as an important means of raising awareness about the extent of racism experienced by communities, as well as securing the appropriate resources and funding to address racism. Employment. Young African Australians face specific challenges in securing and keeping employment as race-based bias was evident. African Australian women are also face similar challenges with employment, and during COVID-19, all of these issues were exacerbated. Education is also a site for race-based harm in educational settings, and access to services, particularly inadequate settlement services for new arrivals, was flagged as a serious concern. So our scoping consultations we heard the concerns. We also identified community priorities to respond, to urgently address racism at a national level, including systemic racism, and particularly in the criminal justice system, increasing racial literacy in Australia through public education and awareness raising, something that the Human Rights Commission is well placed to support, taking an intersectional approach to understanding racism and anti-racism action. These would be familiar concepts to all of you, the intersection of race, religion, race, gender, race and LGBTIQA+ status, race and disability. Each is a compounding intersectional collection of issues, and the need to build more culturally safe workplaces and educational institutions, and improving legal protection framework. So the work of the Commission now is through the National Anti-Racism Strategy, and I'm pleased to say that we've been funded for 4 years to develop a strategy. There are 2 streams of work: the development of a national anti-racism framework and updating our anti-racism public awareness materials. And in terms of the framework, what is crucial is the progressing of community level consultations. It's giving voice and listening from a community-based perspective as to what the solutions are that need to be incorporated in an anti-racism framework. Another area, and I'm conscious of the need to wrap up, another area of concern is the issue of asylum seekers in Australia and the mandatory immigration detention, which has been a constant source of concern for the Australian Human Rights Commission domestically, and of attention amongst our international communities under the Convention obligations. And I am pleased to say that in November last year, our High Court, the highest court in our nation, delivered a very significant judgment about the indefinite detention in Australia and its lawfulness. And so overturning, which is a very unusual thing, overturning a decision of its own of 20 years before, which had given legitimacy to a practice of essentially indefinite detention in our immigration detention settings. So that is a huge paradigm shift in our domestic law. So in conclusion, combating racism is an absolutely integral part of every national human rights institution's work to promote, educate and advocate for the equal rights of its nation's people. It is our job to give voice to the voiceless and to make audible the inaudible and to make visible the invisible, again, to use Barbara Reynolds' conceptualization. And these efforts require holistic approaches across legal, institutional and policy frameworks, and targeting the systemic roots of discrimination through anti-racism education and awareness raising. The unique experiences of Africans and those of African descent are critical in this process, as NHRIs, including the Australian Human Rights Commission, continue to strive for an environment which in all people are enabled to thrive. Thank you, Mr. Mungoven, and thank you to my esteemed colleagues and the chairperson of this overall session. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Croucher, and great to have you join us as a long-time friend and partner in our work. I think it's a very good example of how a national legislation, national strategy, and in particular a national institution can complement and reinforce the work that we've heard from the committee and the working group. And of course, we had the working group visit Australia last year. And I think this complementarity of role of the national institution is especially important in our region, where we don't have strong equivalent regional mechanisms. Thank you very much, Professor Croucher. It now gives me a pleasure to invite, for a civil society perspective, Ms. Megumi Komori from the International Movement Against Racial Discrimination. You have the floor.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, for the moderator, to introduce me, and thank you for the distinguished speakers and the guests. Thank you for inviting me to the meeting. It is an honor for me to share our work with you. I will use the PowerPoint to show what I'm going to speak about. Oh, can I use the, okay. Thank you. And I am Megumi Komori from the IDPAD, International Movement Against All Forms of Discrimination and Racism, based in Japan. I will speak about how civil society organizations work against racial discrimination at the national, regional, and international levels, mainly focusing on the national and international human rights frameworks. Japan has different racialized communities. The map shows a size of each community based on official statistics. These are Black community, which is discriminated against on descent, Ainu and Ryukyu indigenous people communities, resident Koreans, who are descendants of those brought to Japan from Korean Peninsula during the colonial time. Migrants and migrant workers, including technical interns and asylum seekers. The total number of these communities is accounted for about 5% of national population. They are subject to racial discrimination based on descent, ethnic and national origins, and race and color. What about legal frameworks to protect them from discrimination and human rights violations? In the past decade, Japan rushed into enacting different acts to address different forms of discrimination. As shown in the slide, each of these acts focuses on a single issue, except for the one on Ainu indigenous peoples, the one on Black discrimination, and the other on hate speech do not have a prohibitive, sanction, and remedial clauses. Even the one for the Ainu, it does not have sanction clause. These acts mainly aim at awareness raising and education. Besides, human rights infrastructures of Japan are not strong and sound. Unlike many other countries in the region, it does not have an independent national human rights institution and adopts no individual communication systems of different human rights treaties. It also does not have a comprehensive anti-discrimination legislation. This situation has caused many negative impacts on human rights of minority as well as majority in society. Japan is a state party to major international human rights treaties. As shown in the slide, IDPAD is most frequently used and referred to by racialized communities and NGOs in their advocacy works. When entering in the human rights treaty, states are required to make domestic laws legal frameworks align with norms and conditions of the treaty in question. When ratifying CEDAW and CRPD, Japan enacted new acts respectively. For CEDAW, however, it only limited to the act to guarantee of equal employment opportunities. As for the CRPD, the act mainly focuses on protection of persons with disabilities from discrimination, rather than establishment of their rights. Talking about the Asia-Pacific region, no unified legal arrangements for human rights have been made so far. With no domestic laws and systems that provide and ensure the access to justice or open the door to the investigation and redress on human rights violations, state reviews by the treaty bodies and the UPR system allow human rights programs on the ground to be examined under international human rights standards that Japan is bound by. Recommendations issued by the specialized international monitoring bodies are important tool for CSOs in their campaigns to fight against discrimination at home. These are also strong tools for advocacy, lobbying, and awareness raising. With the advanced information technologies today, we have much easier access to programs and services of the OHCHR, Human Rights Council, and other related agencies. This also provides us with good opportunities for capacity building. With the initiatives of the OHCHR, we participated in regional meetings on different agendas, including the Human Rights 75 last October and many others over the past decades. We encourage more fora, workshops, or meetings at the regional level to be organized by the OHCHR, its regional office, and special rapporteurs such as the Special Rapporteur on Minority Issues. In the civil space, IMADA has been involved in the Asia Dalit Rights Forum. IMADA took the initiatives to organize the East Asia Regional Consultation for the Elimination of Racism 6 times in 2020 and 2021 during the corona pandemic time. These have given us opportunities to know, understand, and learn from each other and result in capacity building, joint actions, and solidarity consolidation. Cross-regional joint works of CSO are more likely to be issue-oriented as human rights problems arise and exist cross-border. These include trafficking in persons, asylum seekers, and multinational business activities. Joint actions would produce synergies and make each participant stronger. We formed the NGO Network for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, or ERD, in Japan. Following the official visit of the former Special Rapporteur on Racism, Mr. Dudu Diem, and the submission of his visit report to the General Assembly in 2006. Since then, ERDNet has participated in the process of the review of the State Party by the Third Human Rights Committee, CSCR, and of the UPR. Forum on Minority Women is organized by Ainu, Black, Resident Korean Women, and IMADA. The forum focuses on the issue of intersectionality and multiple forms of discrimination. In regard to the single issue such as the creation of the independent national human rights institution, the adoption of comprehensive anti-discrimination law, and the acceptance of individual complaints, we need a cross-sectoral nationwide platform where CSOs with various causes and backgrounds come and join to work together. A national human rights institution is a must to genuinely attend to victims of discrimination and human rights violation. A comprehensive anti-discrimination legislation can be achieved through the multi-sectoral and multi-issue-oriented nationwide coalition. To be comprehensive, legislation ensures equality and non-discrimination. Also, it is needed for Japan to be part of the regional efforts for human rights such as Asia Pacific Forum. Our work at the local national level, regional level, and international level has attested the importance of intersectional effort at these three different spheres. This could be more explored. Finally, this is a cover page of the Japanese version of a practical guide to developing anti-discrimination legislation that OHCHR and ERT, Equal Rights Trust, published a year ago. We will start our campaign to promote the adoption in Japan while seeking for collaborations at the national, regional, and international levels. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ms. Komori, for that excellent presentation of the different strategies deployed by civil society organizations against discrimination and racism at the national, regional, and international level. Thank you also for bringing that reference to the private sector and engagement with the business community as an additional aspect of this work. We have used our time very well this morning because we've had such rich contributions from our panelists, but unfortunately it leaves us with a little time pressure now. We suggest we run this session until 11:45 and take a few initial statements and interventions from the floor. I just remind participants that there is another opportunity this afternoon in the second part of this panel where we may have a little bit more time to hear from the floor. So please, if I can ask to prioritize any participants who may not be able to join again this afternoon. And if you could also keep any interventions quite short, no more than 2 minutes. So let me first invite any member states present who would like to take the floor. I see a few in the room. Online, if colleagues have identified anyone online. Member states. Then I will pass to national institutions. Of course, we heard from Professor Croucher, but together here in the room or online, are there any contributions from national institution? Then from our civil society participants and academic participants, we welcome your contribution. Please, at the back of the room. So could you identify yourself if comfortable, and then we welcome your remarks.
Thank you, moderator. Thank you, Rory. It's good to see you after a few years. I'm Mario Gomez from Sri Lanka. a human rights lawyer in Sri Lanka, but currently associated with the International Center for Ethnic Studies. I just wanted to pick up on two things. One by Professor Croucher on the role of national human rights institutions. And I know the Australian National Human Rights Institution has been a pioneer with regard to public inquiries in Australia. And I was just wondering whether there's a role for the Asia-Pacific Forum on NHRIs to take up the issue of people of African descent, not just in Australia, but across the Asia-Pacific region, which may even entail sort of collective activities across Asia-Pacific region, and whether there's any space for the Australian Human Rights Commission to lead such an initiative across the Asia-Pacific region, which may bring together the different NHRIs in the Asia-Pacific region. That's just one teeny-weeny comment. But another, I just wanted to also endorse the comments that Professor Chung and Dr. Reynolds made on the need to integrate and to build really plural and inclusive histories, whether it's in schools, in universities, or even outside sort of educational institutions, and to ensure that histories of our region include the narratives and the stories of people of African descent. And this may not be confined to mere textbooks or textual productions, but could also go beyond that to embrace the arts, whether it's film, music, dance, or other types of arts. So these are just two teeny-weeny requests for this distinguished forum. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much, Mario. And just for participants who may not be aware, the Asia-Pacific Forum is an umbrella body of national institutions in the region, and so can both help national institutions to mainstream this issue, but also perhaps do something collective at the regional level. And thank you also for your emphasis on, again, this the education, media, arts, history narratives as so important in terms of visibility. Are there other contributions from the floor? Please.
Yes, my name is Elizabeth Lang from Australia. So I'm a 2020 Fellow of the Programme for People of African Descent, as well as representative of Diversity Focus, a racial and gender equity research and training consultancy based in Australia. So the point of data collection and the necessity of keeping race in view, which has been raised by a number of speakers, including the High Commissioner in his opening address this morning, as well as also further elaborated on by Barbara Reynolds and other speakers. So we know that this is a key point or a key step to any and all interventions to address systemic racism. Now, what opportunities exist or can be created by nation states and national institutions to realize this necessary step in the face of great resistance to the very acceptance and acknowledgement of the very existence of people of African descent? Thank you.
Thank you very much for this comment. We'll ask the panelists to respond. But are there any, please? Oh, and sorry.
Thank you to our dear moderator. I am Associate Professor Mimmie Claudine Watts from Federation University, Australia, but I'm also the chair of the African Science Research and Innovation Council, African Union Commission for the Australian chapter. I'm going to do a presentation later this afternoon, so I'm not going to dwell, but I'm very honored to listen to the previous speakers, especially Mrs. Reynolds, but also Mrs. Rosalind Croucher, whom I think my statement is really in relation to some of the really rich content that both of them shared. But for Ms. Reynolds, for example, some of the things that you highlighted are very well known in Australia, but more so the lack of prevalence of national data security is a necessary resource that we actually need. But something that is very obvious in Australia is the lack of African people leading some of our national institutions. They're almost always absent. So but there has been a lot of structural changes, and when you see people in leadership positions, most often than not, they've created those opportunities for themselves, but they are not appointed into some of our key national institutions. And it will really be wonderful if we see that reflected in the office of the Discrimination Commissioner, because that's a key position that no African person anywhere has ever held. And this is reflected across so many other state institutions, but also national institutions in Australia, and I think across the region. I will end there, and I'll invite you to listen to me later this afternoon. Thank you all.
Thank you. And we'll just take one last intervention from the floor, and then I'll ask some of the panelists to respond.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep. Wasakama Melda Davis, and I'm the chair of a not-for-profit voluntary organisation, National Representative, Australian South Sea Islanders, Port Jackson. We're descendants of Australia's blackbirding trade, and I'll be speaking of this tomorrow, but at the same time, my question is for Professor Reynolds. It's good to see you again, and I've been working in this space for the better part of close to 2 decades. Australian South Sea Islanders, we are descendants of the Pacific slave trade. We have an evident kinship with First Nations Australians. We have an evident kinship with those Africans brought on the First Fleet as a part of colonialism. I guess, you know, having been there for 176 years, our peoples from the Pacific, and despite the advocacy work that's been done for the better part of those 176 years since colonisation, some 230 years ago, I'd like to know what the Human Rights Commission is doing for Australian South Sea Islanders, and how are we going to progress from this point on? Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. And I must say, as an Australian, I'm really pleased to see this level of mobilisation, which I think must reflect, you know, really positively actually on the working group's visit last year. I think this shows how, you know, the international mechanism can catalyse an agenda in this way, and I think it's great that we have so many Australian voices in the room today. Let me pass to the panels. I think perhaps we should hear from Professor Croucher in relation to some of these comments related to national inquiries and to the Australian agenda, and then perhaps to Professor Reynolds in terms of those wider issues of data and representation, but then if there is time, others as well. But let's hear from you, Professor Croucher.
Thank you, Rory. And thank you for the questions. They were fantastic. It really speaks to a level of engagement, sophisticated level of engagement with the issues and the possibilities. I think several things. One, the inquiry function. Thank you. It was a really good question. Our inquiry work is one of the key aspects of the work that we do. And but inquiry work is time and resource intensive. So we as most NHRIs are fairly resource constrained, we obviously choose and prioritise and develop really key partnerships about the work that we do. And the National Anti-Racism Framework is a really good way, and we have government supporting that for 4 years as additional funding, and that provides the conceptual and institutional structure through which a whole range of the more specific and targeted inquiries might develop. So I thank you for that question. And some of the areas that I identified as coming from the communities themselves spoke to the possibility of where the language, sorry, I'm getting a language prompt, might have switched me to a different language.
You're clear. We can hear you clearly.
Oh, okay, all right. So, you know, I know my language, it's getting quite late at night for me, but I didn't think my language was dropping off to that extent. So yes, I think inquiries are fantastic. Given we're nearly 40 years old now, the inquiries that we do, I speak of the long horizon of the work that we do. And I think even the change in the law that I spoke to in my presentation achieved through the High Court, the Human Rights Commission has been a constant presence in advancing those arguments. So I think the framework will give the context for specific policy focus for many, many inquiries over the years. The expert group identified the work that we were doing, and I thank this group for the suggestions. The suggestion of a commissioner drawn from our Australians of African descent, I would love to see that. We're just about to appoint. I don't recall there being any applicants actually drawn from that community. So I would suggest that part of the advocacy that everyone represented in the room can do is when the position is advertised again in 5 years' time, work your communities and encourage people to apply to change the representation of that key role at the Human Rights Commission. I understand that the announcement will be made early February, indeed, for the next Race Discrimination Commissioner. We've had commissioners drawn from Chinese Australian, from Lao Australians. In the two recent ones have been drawn from some of our migrant communities, of newer migrant communities. And I would welcome the broadening of that. But it's one role among many. And I think what the Human Rights Commission has done through its focus on listening and community consultation is to ensure that within the structures that we have, but the processes that we embrace are grounded in community and community voices. So while the figureheads may be only a handful of people, we hope that the voices that we're capturing are much wider than those. So perhaps, learned moderator, I might finish it at that point.
Good. Thank you very much. And perhaps we can come back to South Sea Islander issue in the afternoon session. If I could also perhaps invite Ms. Reynolds, if you would like to have, with the permission of the other panelists, perhaps the last words, and we'll then move to a break. But just to remind, we will have an opportunity to come back to this topic and discussion in the afternoon. Ms. Reynolds?
Moderator, thank you so much. To the questions asked, I think people of African descent have got to run for every office in their country, whether it's the school board, the community board, just run for office. That gives experience, it gives credibility. That's one. I think it's important that people of African descent intertwine their dual histories, and that is to become as familiar as possible with the history, in this instance, of Australia, but any other country as it is of Africa, because that merging of the identities is so critical, and we commented on this in our report. That's the second thing. Third, I think people of African descent who are professionals have got to step up and say, we're not just going to get on air on television or on radio when you're talking about a quote-unquote Black issue, but when you're talking about sports and entertainment and science and research. And if you're a marine biologist, go and talk about marine biology, because that also broadens the portrayal of who people of African descent are. The fourth, I would say, write as many letters as you can to your constituent representatives and ask them to put forward concrete and specific resolutions in Parliament or whatever the political system is. Bombard them in a courteous way. The fifth thing I would say is definitely to join in solidarity with other groups that are fighting for the same causes with which you're fighting. Express that solidarity. Fight for all people's rights, because as I always say, when we fight for the rights of one group, we fight for the rights of all human beings. So I would offer those 5 things as a short list. Mr. Chairperson, may I please thank you for the opportunity of joining this earlier panel, and may I please be excused, it's the beginning of the semester, it's 6:52 a.m. in Trinidad and Tobago, and I do have some commitments with regards to the start of the semester. So to my fellow panelists, I will definitely review the recordings, and I wish everybody a really, really good MJK Day. Thank you so much.
So let me just close by thanking all of our distinguished panelists, particularly Ms. Reynolds so early there and Professor Croucher so late there, but all of our panelists, both here in the room and online, for your very, very valuable contributions. And for those of us following the discussion later this afternoon, we look forward to more contributions and issues and questions from our participants. So with that, I apologize for running over, but I think we've had a very, very, very good start to the consultation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Mungoven, for your excellent moderation. I would like to join you in thanking our distinguished panelists. I also thank the state representative and meeting participants for their attention and important contributions. I now declare the first meeting of this regional the first panel of this regional meeting for Asia and the Pacific on the International Decade for People of African Descent closed. I invite all the attendees to reconvene today at 1:45. I don't know at what time it will be for those online, here in the same room or online, to continue our discussion under the same theme, recognition. I also remind and invite all participants to the special event entitled Voices of the Decade, Connecting Cultures Through Art and Media, to be held in this room and online at 12:30. So I have also been asked to inform that for the break, we have a coffee here where you can definitely have a variety of options for lunch. So I will hand over the floor to the Secretariat to give some information to participants. Thank you. I declare open the second meeting of the regional, the second session, let's say, the second segment, let's say, the afternoon segment of the regional meeting for Asia and the Pacific on the International Decade for People of African Descent. For the next hour and a half, we will continue our discussion on recognition. I invite again our excellent moderator, Mr. Rory Mungoven, Chief of OHSR Asia Pacific section, to moderate the second part of this panel discussion. Mr. Mungoven, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Chairperson Aziz. Welcome to our distinguished panelists online for this session, and to all of the member states and other participants who've joined us here in the room and online. This is the second segment of our first panel discussion on recognition, building strong frameworks to promote equality, non-discrimination and social harmony in the Asia-Pacific region. And it was designed in two parts because of the time difference to sort of allow the maximum number of participants to join us, especially online. So welcome to all of those of you who have joined this morning and this afternoon. I won't go over in detail the very, very rich presentations that we had this morning from our distinguished panelists, but perhaps as some may be joining now and have missed the morning session, just to recap, we heard from Dr. Chinsung Chung, from the Republic of Korea, but who is a vice chair of the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. She talked about of course, the importance of the Convention of General Comment 34. She highlighted some of the gaps in ratification we have in the region, also the lack of a regional mechanism for Asia and the Pacific, but she also highlighted some of the patterns and common issues that the committee has observed in its periodic reviews of different member states from the Asia-Pacific region. We then heard from Ms. Barbara Reynolds, who is the chair of the UN Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent. The working group, of course, had made a visit to Australia last year, and in fact it was interesting the number of Australian participants that we had join us for this consultation. Ms. Reynolds stressed very much in terms of this theme of recognition, the invisibility and the inaudibility of people of African descent in this region. And she unpacked a little bit for us the concept of representation, of recognition in four elements. Recognition in terms of legal frameworks, representation of history and culture, focus in policies and programs through the accurate provision of data, and finally representation in terms of governance and participation and decision making. This is really the key messages from Ms. Reynolds. We then had a presentation from Ms. Sara Arriola, who is the Regional Director for Asia and the Pacific of the International Organization for Migration. She connected our discussion to the wider framework of the Sustainable Development Agenda and the Global Compact on Migration. She talked about some of the kind of demographic and mobility trends that we see worldwide, and that, of course, significantly increasing the contact and linkages between Africa, people of African descent, and countries in the Asia-Pacific region. We then heard from Professor Rosalind Croucher, who is the president of the Australian Human Rights Commission, a national human rights institution. She reflected very much on the way a national institution can work to complement the international mechanisms, the national legal framework, the national strategy on racism, the consultations the Commission has been holding with the different communities. She also mentioned outreach to the private sector and to business, which is a theme that came up once or twice in the morning discussion. And finally, we heard from Ms. Megumi Komori, who's the Secretary General of the International Movement Against All Forms of Discrimination and Racism, based in Japan. And she gave a very good civil society perspective in terms of how a civil society organization and networks in Japan strategize on the national, on the regional, on the international level to advance this agenda, particularly given the gaps they experience in terms of their discrimination law and also in the absence of a national institution. So we had very, very good input from the panel. We had several interventions on the floor highlighting, again, the importance of national institutions and their inquiry function, whether this could be used to increase the visibility of the African descent issues. We heard again about the importance of representation, particularly in kind of key appointments to national institutions and anti-racism bodies. particularly given the kind of the connections between this agenda and other forms of discrimination. And we also heard specifically about the South Pacific Islander community in Australia. We'll hear more tomorrow, but whose experience sits very much at this nexus of African descent, enslavement, racism, indigeneity, and the whole, it really illustrates the intersectionality of these issues. So it was a very productive morning session, and we look forward to more interventions from all of you this afternoon. So I'm very pleased that we have a second part to the panel now, and we have two more panelists who will present to us, and then we will be able to open the floor. So let me welcome and introduce our two panelists joining online. Firstly, Ms. Linh Moreau, who is Secretary General of the UNESCO Memory of the World Committee for Asia and the Pacific since 2022. Prior to joining UNESCO in Bangkok, she was a program officer of the Southeast Asian Ministers of Education's Organizational Regional Center on Archaeology and the Fine Arts. She completed her studies in Southeast Asian Studies at SOAS at the University of London, and she has a master's degree from the University of Paris, Sorbonne Nouvelle. Our second speaker will be Professor Mimmie Claudine Watts, who is an Associate Professor of Nursing, Public Health, Leadership, and a Director of Industry Cooperation at the Federation University, Australia, where she coordinates the Master of Health Leadership and Health Services Management program. Associate Professor Watts is the Chair of the African Science Research and Innovation Council of the African Union Commission, representing the Australian chapter, and she's a policy committee member of the World Federation of Public Health Associations. She has a PhD in public health from La Trobe University and a Masters of Public Health from the University of Melbourne. And we're very pleased to welcome Professor Watts here in the room. So without further ado, I'll invite Ms. Linh first, perhaps to share with us, and we welcome your presentation.
Good evening, everyone from Bangkok, Thailand. Thank you very much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's been really interesting to listen to the previous discussion where I learned a lot. So I, as was mentioned, I'm affiliated with the Memory of the World Committee for Asia and the Pacific, and I'm a consultant at UNESCO Bangkok. While I am from the Asia Pacific side of the Memory of the World program, I developed this presentation in close consultation with my colleagues in Senegal and Vietnam. So I would like to firstly thank Mr. Papa Momar Diop in Senegal and Dr. Vu Thi Minh Hung in Vietnam for helping me with this as a collaborative endeavor. So without further ado, maybe do I share my screen or somebody else is sharing my screen?
Please share your screen.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Okay. Great, can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Perfect.
Yes,
okay.
we can see your screen. I don't know
Perfect,
if your
you,
mic is obstructed. We're just getting a little bit of distortion. We can hear you, but it's a bit, little bit of static.
Okay, so maybe I'll switch to my daughter's headphones. I've been having problems with this all day, actually. So please bear with me and let me see if I can make this work. Just hold on one second. How's that? Can you hear me better?
Yeah, that's much clearer. Thank you.
So I'm afraid I can't.
Oh, you can't hear us? That is clear for us. Do you want to just send a message on the chat? I think if we continue, then she could switch for the discussion.
Right, sorry, I'm just going to go back to.
That was clearer with the other headphones, but...
Okay, I'm really sorry. So maybe it was clear with the other headphones, but I couldn't hear you.
that sounds better, no? Yeah. I think that sounds better now, actually. I think the sound is fine. Thank you very much.
Great, sorry about that. So I'll try to run through this quickly. Okay, so what is it that we do with the Memory of the World program? It's a rather niche topic, so I'm just going to quickly run through it. Sorry. Okay, so what is documentary heritage? It involves either a single or collection of documents, and it could either be analog or digital informational content, covering various media, and it includes its carrier. And what's important is how significant it is to the collective memory of a community, a country, a region, or the world. So what can documentary heritage be made of? It can be made from paper, leaves of tree bark, from any form of tree. In the Asia Pacific region, is often bamboo. It could also be stone inscriptions, inscriptions on metal, engravings, or it could be on animal bone. And so this is what would comprise the older materials. It could also be made of modern materials, which includes audio recordings, photography, film and video, newsprint, and digital media. And it could also be something as contemporary as cloud storage. So we're really talking like vast array of media and really diverse topics. And where can you find it? You can find it in various places, many of which are listed here. Of course, a library and National Archives, but you can also find it in your own home. In fact, one of the items inscribed on the MOCAP register, which is the Asia Pacific Register for the Memory of the World, is a collection that is under the guardianship of a family in northern Vietnam. And actually, they welcome anyone who would like to come view the collection. So what is the Memory of the World program? So I think many of you are aware of the ICH program, which is the Intangible Cultural Heritage one, which involves dance, music, and cultural expressions. And I think all of you are aware of the UNESCO World Heritage Sites and monuments and landscapes. So the Memory of the World program is really like this niche cultural heritage topic that involves books, manuscripts, films, and archives. And it was born in 1992 as a response to the deliberate destruction of the National and University Library of Bosnia, where over 1 million books and manuscripts were lost. And this is pointed out to a problem in terms of safeguarding and promoting the documentary heritage of the world. And so the vision of the Memory of the World program is to promote how documentary heritage belongs to all and needs to be made accessible to all, as well as to increase awareness on the importance of protecting the world's documentary heritage and achieving its universal permanence and accessibility. The Memory of the World's program's objectives are to preserve documentary heritage through technical assistance programs, capacity building, and also linking donors with various projects, as well as with promoting and enabling access through original forms and digitized copies, and promoting awareness through identifying documentary heritage that's in need of preservation, developing and managing regional or national Memory of the World registers, and through publications and exhibitions. Sorry if I'm going a bit faster, but since we started late. So here's where we connect Africa with Asia and the Pacific, and this is what we're all here for today after that I hope quick background. So the Memory of the World program has various levels of registers. There is, of course, the international register, which is much like the the intangible cultural heritage one and the site registers. But what the Memory of the World program has in particular, and what makes it different from the other programs, is that it has regional registers. So there's the Africa Register, which is represented by the Africa Regional Committee for the Memory of the World, also known as ARCMO. And then there's one for Asia Pacific, known as MOCAP, and for Latin America and the Caribbean, known as MOLAC. And there are also various national registers, depending on the country and on the region. So for example, in the Asia Pacific region, I think we have at present, or at the last time of assessment, there are about 14 to 15 countries that have a national Memory of the World register. And we're working on developing these in the African region as well. So let's learn about these Memory of the World inscriptions. So actually, there are 490 inscriptions on the International Memory of the World Register, among which there are 26 from Africa, which represents only 5%. And there are 119 from Asia Pacific, which represents about a quarter. So I think this graph really demonstrates the disparity and the need to further promote African documentary heritage on the international stage. And so that is how ARCMO, the African chapter of the Moreau Committee, and Asia Pacific one got together to do activities, joint activities, to try to develop the Memory of the World program in Africa, and also to develop collaborations between Africa and Asia Pacific. So on the 26th of July, 2022, which was over a year ago, a bit over a year ago, we organized an interregional dialogue between ARCMO, the Africa chapter, and MOCAP, the Asia Pacific chapter. And this was really the kick-starting meeting between both regions. And during this meeting, both committees shared their experiences in operating a regional Memory of the World committee and in developing a regional Memory of the World register, and how they've been able to engage with member states in creating national Memory of the World committees. And it was a really wonderful event, because really people from Africa and the Asia Pacific region really discussed opportunities and especially the challenges that they were facing. And it turned out that we're actually facing the same challenges in both regions, be it funding, or people knowing about the program, or even people caring about documentary heritage in the first place. Documentary heritage is usually quite small. It doesn't really have that visual impact that a site or a monument will have. And so garnering public awareness or funding for it can be quite problematic. We also got together quite recently, so a couple months ago, in the Republic of Korea, where we shared how our regional committees were structured and operated, and even more challenges. But this time, we also included Latin America and the Caribbean. We discussed opportunities for collaboration, which I will present very shortly, and future interregional activities. And most importantly, during that time, we signed a memorandum of understanding between Africa, Asia Pacific, and Latin America and the Caribbean to collaborate on documentary heritage through the Memory of the World program. You can see here, there's a picture of me with the president of the Africa chapter, Mr. Papa Momar Diop. And these events are really important, because not only do we become closer colleagues, but we become friends. And it's through activities like this that I can turn to him to deliver presentations just like the one I'm giving today. So I'm going to now go back into the history of the Memory of the World program and just mention some of the inscriptions that link Africa and Asia and the Pacific. So we have the archives from the Dutch East India Company, which was inscribed in 2003. And it has South Asia, Indonesia, the Netherlands, and South Africa and Sri Lanka. Then we have the records of the Indian indentured laborers. So that includes Fiji in the Pacific. It includes states in Latin America and the Caribbean, and Suriname. And then we have the Bandung Conference, the Asian African Conference Archives, which was inscribed in 2015. And so earlier I mentioned the meeting that we had on opportunities for collaboration between all of the different regions that are running the Memory of the World program. So one of them would be to expand the content on the Women in History virtual exhibition, because this is a really great project. It's a website that you can check out on at mowherstory.org, and it puts together all of the inscriptions that document the participation of women or celebrating women in history through the Memory of the World program. And what was really disconcerting in conducting the research for this is just like how there are very few African-related inscriptions, there are also very few inscriptions that are related to women on the Memory of the World program. And so with that, we thought it would be a great idea to expand the content on this website to include items from the African region. There's also the Let's Explore the Memory of the World children's book, which is mostly focused on Asia and the Pacific. But we're thinking of expanding that with content from Africa as well. And also this year, we will be celebrating the 10th anniversary of the Bandung Conference being inscribed on the Memory of the World Register. So we're currently in talks with doing an event on that, so we can really promote what this means for interregional and South-South collaboration, especially in this post-World War II context and post-colonial context. As for items that we can think of in the future, now these are just ideas that we've been throwing around, and actually I would love if all of you in the room and anybody here could think about anything that could be put forward for the Memory of the World program that could link Asia, Pacific, and Africa together. Because there must be, and there are archives related to migration diasporas between Africa and Asia and Pacific, such as the Afro-Asians in South Asia, descendants of the Bantu peoples who are in Pakistan, India, as well as in Sri Lanka. It was also brought to my attention that there is a Vietnamese and Senegalese community living in Senegal, and vice versa in Vietnam as well. A result of colonialism, obviously. There was also the presence of the Tirailleurs Senegalais in Indochina. They were just Senegalese, they were from all over Africa, but they had a big impact from their presence in Indochina. And also in 1966, there was a South-South cooperation movement that was created called the Organization of Solidarity with the people of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And so if we could identify and put together archives related to that, that could also be something we could look into and think about. On a less post-colonial, post-World War II note, we can also think about connections in terms of arts and design, so colonial architectural drawings, or for example, like the registration of Ankara African fabric designs, which came from Indonesia via the Netherlands. So as you can see from this picture, there's a collection of these registered designs that really kind of went from one region to the other via the Netherlands. And also, we could also look into oral literature and history from the shared indigenous knowledge of Austronesia. I don't know if some of you know, but in Mauritius, their language is actually an Austronesian language, which is linked to those that are spoken in Indonesia and Malaysia and in the indigenous peoples of Taiwan. So there there may be something to do with that, because actually the Memory of the World program also involves intangible oral history, so they could be recordings and videos of that. As for upcoming activities that we've discussed and are really happy that we're going to be implementing soon between all of the regions, we're going to be sharing results from activities that are happening in Africa and Asia Pacific, and the experts are going to share them amongst themselves and see what can be done in terms of identifying ideas for joint nominations. And we will also be organizing capacity building workshops and seminars. We're going to try to include all regions as much as possible, including the MOCAP General Meeting, which is coming this year. We'll be inviting our friends in Africa as well as Latin America and the Caribbean. We're really trying to gear up working together. So I hope I didn't take too long to go over quite a niche subject, but one that I'm really passionate about and I'm very proud to represent. So thank you so much for your attention. And if you want to ask more questions about what we do at the Memory of the World program, or even if you have any ideas about Africa and Asia Pacific connections and documentary heritage, please, I'd be happy to hear from you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Moreau. I mean, it was really fascinating, and I think linked very much to what Ms. Reynolds said this morning about this historical dimension being a very important part of recognition, and that this is not an issue that is a new phenomenon in terms of migration or student exchange, but has much deeper historical roots and legacy in the region. Including linked to colonialism and enslavement. So thank you very much for opening our eyes to those possibilities through the UNESCO program and the interesting inter-regional collaboration that's going on with the African Committee. Our next speaker is of course, Professor Mimmie Claudine Watts from the Federation University in Australia, and very happy to have you here and to give you the floor.
Thank you so much. I've got a presentation. Could you kindly share the presentation slide, please? So thank you for inviting me here to share a statement on the role of data in promoting equality and non-discrimination with a focus on Africans and people of Afro ancestry in the Asia-Pacific region. I'm Mimmie Claudine Watts, Associate Professor at Federation University, but I'm also the chair of the African Science Research and Innovation Council for the African Union Commission, and I chair the Australian chapter. So thank you to the Commissioner and the Office for organizing this, but also to just share some insight into data, and here bring in the community advocacy lens, the policy lens, but also academic research. I acknowledge that this is, so I'll start by acknowledging the indigenous people of the land upon which we stand, as they are the custodians of the waters that our universities' campuses are built on, elders past and present. But I also want to acknowledge all of you in this room, but importantly, the people of African descent who live in the Asia-Pacific region. It is important that your voices are heard, but also you are recognized for the contribution that you continue to make, and that is why we are all here today. This statement builds on and aligns with and complements the previous statements, but also work that has been done in this region. So building on that, I'm going to provide some context on Afro-descendants in the region. I'll share some strategies to advance data, and I'll just conclude with some recommendations. So the African people in the Asia-Pacific region have been present in this region of the world from the outset. Despite these recent patterns of migration and settlement in the literature, Africa was and remains the mother of the continent, not only due to its rich natural resources, but because it is the cradle of civilization. The fourth industrial revolution is one of the most significant achievements of the 21st century, with data being one of its byproducts. Who has and controls data will direct and influence geopolitics globally. Consequently, there is a need to be active participants of the fourth industrial revolution, not just passive consumers and data generations, which seems to be the case for most Africans. This statement focuses on the collection and use of such data by policymakers in promoting policy and non-discrimination practices in relation to individuals from African descent in the Asia-Pacific region. As we heard from some of the speakers earlier today, it is very difficult to know the number of people who live in the Asia-Pacific region, but the estimates are somewhere over 5 million. It is safe to say that reliance on national data may only be an indicator of reasonable and acceptable estimates of African descent in the Asia-Pacific region. And this is difficult for policymakers who must make effective policies about African descendants that are not based on evidence from their own communities. In Australia, for example, it is estimated that there are about 400 to 500,000 individuals who identify as Africans or as descendants. This group is quite diverse due to the complex history and patterns of migration to Australia from Africa and from around the world. The dominant African groups in the past 4 decades from Africa to Australia were primarily from countries with instability and war, reflected across the African continent, and this is indicated in their numbers around the country. Those who migrated recently over the past 2 decades tend to be people like myself who are skilled migrants. Historically, Africans from the north of Africa were given preference in migration. However, most did not often perceive themselves as Africans, and so did the receiving nations. And this is comparable to the number of South Africans, primarily white, who were desired to relocate to Australia, and that has been the case in the last decade. This pattern is common in the Asia-Pacific region, but throughout the world, and this goes to illustrate some of the difficulties in identifying who is African and where they reside. Africans continue to face racial hierarchies, racial pay disparities, racism, higher unemployment rates, lower levels of professional success through promotions, etc., leading to trauma and poorer health. And somebody who is an educator, but also a health professional, I sit on both sides and I hear a lot of stories. Overrepresentation in jails and underrepresentation in senior roles are common among Africans. And I got invited a few years ago to develop some policies, but also to engage in some work for young African people who were increasingly being overrepresented in jails. And I must say it was a different sight for me entering some of our maximum security prisons in Australia. I had not been to a prison before. It changed my perspective. The research and data disparity remains, and Africans and their descendants were not initially included in most research, either as participants or as researchers, and they continue to fall short in representative data and research. And as a result, we know historically, example being the Tuskegee trial, for example, where African Americans were deliberately infected with syphilis, but also immunization that people did not provide informed consent. As a result, people have developed mistrust for social workers and health professionals, which in itself is a challenge. Data equity for minority groups remains a critical concern that has gained attention in recent years. The pursuit of such data collection has profound implications for the community with the aim of delivering equity in policy. African people and their descendants are visibly different in color. There is a dearth of literature on the challenges, racial discrimination, lesser opportunities, etc., in comparison to other groups that Black people face globally. It is imperative to understand that these challenges we must generate data and knowledge pertinent to Black people, but also for their advancement if we are to change policy. Without accurate and comprehensive data, the unique needs and challenges of experiences of Black people will be overlooked, and poorly collected data may disadvantage Black people for so many reasons. Further, data generated through artificial intelligence poses another barrier on inclusion for people of color, particularly for Black people. And algorithms used in such data mining often exclude Black people where they should be included, while simultaneously overrepresenting them in areas of crime and areas where Black people have been misrepresented historically. Challenges in data collection and analysis are issues that must be considered and addressed, and this must be led by people from those communities. This statement, therefore, attempts to ensure fairness in policy making, and below I highlight some of the strategies that ensure the efficiency of data collection and highlighted, followed by some recommendations. Strategies to advance data equity for African descendants. We need to have representation in research, informed consent, ethical use of data, ethical policies, ensure that minority voices and representation are part of the data mining data being collected. I'm going to highlight each of those. So in terms of representation in research, historically excluded Africans from any research, particularly women. And it is essential that the voices of all individuals from minority groups, particularly those of African descent, living in the Asia-Pacific region, be included in studies regardless of the type, but it must be ethically approved. I must say we've got a longitudinal women's study that has been going now for over 30 years in Australia. Not a single Black woman, and primarily, mostly people of Asian ancestry were not included. People like myself have advocated, and there is little still to be done. And I say that because I've spoken to and engaged with the people in that area. So it is really imperative, and there are other examples that I could give. Secondly, when we talk about informed consent, ensure that minority voices are represented, a part of the data being collected. And this can be achieved by using culturally competent methods and community participatory action research methods that include those voices, particularly marginalized groups. And when we think about marginalized groups, we're looking at those who are often not accepted by society. Women, sex workers in particular in those areas. Those are some of the marginalized groups that we really need to think about. Further, in informed consent, we really need to think how data is utilized and must be acceptable to the individuals or to the communities that the data has been collected or mined from. Regarding ethical policies, the ethical use of data along with ethical approaches to data collection demonstrate trust, but it builds rapport amongst individuals, ensuring that data is collected ethically and it enhances the participation of people from those communities in any research. Ethical data will ensure that the privacy and confidentiality of individuals are respected and that the individuals are protected from adverse outcomes. And I always say, and we've done research in the past, that the outcomes were going to be very negative to the community. And I recall we had to make a decision to suppress that information because research should not damage a community. It should strengthen the community. Ethical policies on what happens to data, particularly the potential for use by third parties, should be part of the research and the national research ethics strategy. Participants must be aware of who else has access to their data, and we are seeing that in the era of information technology, and people just click and share information. And I've got a detailed paper that I've actually written on this topic on ethical policies, but we really need the national governments to add voice, but really to have laws in place that protect the vulnerable groups who are uninformed. People from minority groups must be part and represented in research, and this is through co-designing of the research projects. This will enhance trust and acceptance of any findings from such research by the community. It is further essential that these groups are informed from the research design phase rather than at the data collection or sometimes even later stages of the process. And could I just say that recently I looked at a PhD and I was on a panel. It was on midwifery, etc. There was not a single woman on the panel of that PhD student, yes, and all the supervisors were male. I really did query it. So it's really important that we think about these things deeply. Further, we need to think about capacity building, diversity in data analysis, using the Afrocentric lens and intersectionality. And in terms of capacity building, this should be a component of the entire process. People from the community of interest must be empowered through education to collect, engage with, and analyze data. It can be accomplished through capacity training workshops or through formal education at the university or other. Having members of the community with comprehensive, informed research knowledge will further enhance existing relationships between the community and the researchers. It will ensure that any research conducted with the community will be of value and benefit to them and to their descendants. Regarding diversity in the data analysis, this increases the diversity of the workforce, but also responsibility, especially when it comes to data analysis. This ensures equity within the entire research project and the research agenda overall. And I think it is we've passed a time where people set an agenda and then bring it to the people to follow the agenda. The people must be part of that design. They must be part of the conceptualization of any project that you have to do with their communities. Ensuring that people of African descent are part of the entire research project, especially during the analysis phase of the research, will eliminate most researcher biases, of course, and improve data analysis and interpretation by using a cultural and an Afrocentric lens. I've written extensively on Afrocentric lens, and you can look at some of my work online and you'll see that. In regards to intersectionality, approach should be employed to analyze any data. This is because intersectionality recognizes and validates the various aspects that individuals exist within. Intersectionality encompasses the entire spectrum of variables and factors such as gender, race, migration, migration status, immigration, education attainment, employment status, multilingualism, barriers, and other protracted life issues. And I could, again, delve into each one of those, but for the interest of time, I'm not. So in terms of recommendations, I think the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, UN, should consider programs in Afrocentric education and research with the aim of building and strengthening research capacity for African descendants in the Asia-Pacific region. And from what I heard this morning, it must be led by the people. That individuals of African descent should be supported and must be funded to conduct research regarding them and their communities. It should not be a byproduct of something else. It must be intentional. Foreign governments won't do this except it is for their own benefits. African governments must lead such initiatives. So I know people are representing different governments, but I know that in Australia, there is a lot of money that is thrown around research, but it's directed for the purposes to support our own initiatives as a country, rather than specifically for other governments. And an example is when you look at the Confucius Institutes around the country, they are not funded primarily by Australian government. They are initiatives of the Chinese government, and it is soft diplomacy. African governments must do something. And I say that as somebody who's worked and done a lot of advocacy, but also as someone who served as a commissioner for multicultural affairs. So it's absolutely important. It is essential for African people and their descendants to be encouraged and supported, as this is essential for their own development. That policies are constructed, or where they exist, are implemented to dismantle structural discrimination against Black people, regardless of their location. In conclusion, strengthening capacity through education while supporting and validating their own cultural knowledge during the process will further enhance the rapport, thus ensuring positive outcomes. Inclusion of multiple voices for data collection, particularly for people of African descent, commencing at the research design phase, I think even at the conceptual phase, through to data collection analysis, while complex, will allow the data to be much more reflective of the diverse nature of the community and society. I know that this morning, for example, Ms. Reynolds did talk about there is no regional data, or some other person did mention that. So this is a common problem, and you cannot make policies for people when you don't know who they are, where they are, what they do, etc. So the fourth industrial revolution provides an opportunity for knowledge creation using modern technologies. Black people and their descendants must be part of this data mining. I'm afraid as the fourth industrial revolution is going to bypass us, even though we are generating and contributing to so much data. And this data must benefit these people because they are harnessing a lot of your capital by population and by numbers. So thank you so much for listening, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to share with you.
Thank you very much, Professor Watts, for giving us this window into the visibility factor and the importance of data, the gaps in data, but also the way data is collected and how that can be a vehicle for participation, for addressing intersectionality, and also challenging us on the ethics of data collection and the new challenges that will arise with artificial intelligence and the function of algorithms. So thank you very much for such a rich presentation. That brings us to the end of the panel, participants at least, and we can now open the floor again for a second segment of statements from member states first, but then other participants. Are there any in the room that would like to take the floor, or any joining online that have signalled? Do we have, I'll just give the first tranche to member states if there is any member state wishing to take the floor before I open to other participants. It's our usual protocol here. It's okay? All right, good, please. If you, again, if participants could just introduce themselves if they're comfortable and their organization or area of work. Thank you.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Delia Ducre. I come from the beautiful nature island of the Commonwealth of Dominica, from the Caribbean, first of all. But I am representing the region of China. I am the current head of the International Department on the Silk Road Youth Forum. My question is to Professor Watts. I am quite interested in knowing the youth aspect in ensuring the minority voices and representations are a part of any data being collected. As we know, Australia is experiencing this new wave of migration of identity of different people from African countries or people of African descent migrating to Australia. So the whole look or the voices of Australia has changed as well. How has the youth been a part of that? And also in the data collection, how has the youth been participating in that whole process? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. Maybe that we'll take a second question from Cloud and then we can come back to the panelists. Cloud?
Hi, I actually just have a word from our sponsors type of intervention. My name is Claude Kahn. I'm from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Minorities and Indigenous People section. We work very closely with the anti-racism section, which convened supporting this meeting. I just wanted to say two things. One, there was no chance at the lunch event to come in, but we have an annual art contest for minority artists. We've done 2 so far, and the third one is open. I left publications outside on the table with the catalogs from the first 2. They were wonderful, really. And we've invited applications from anyone for the 3rd round. It is now open, and the theme is memory in the present, so we're focusing on memorialization and the impact of legacies of racism and related intolerance on current affairs, current societies. If you have a look, it's really, it's really gripping stuff, some of the things that were brought forward. It's an effort to support the voices and visions of minorities and people of African descent and others in communicating through our artistic medium on human rights themes, so minority artists as human rights defenders. If you have the chance to disseminate the materials, that would be great. If you have questions, please get in touch with any one of our colleagues here, and they can channel the answers to you. That's one of the things we've left outside. Secondly, there's a thick publication called Protecting Minority Rights, a Guide to Developing Comprehensive Anti-Discrimination Law. We are pushing to support better protection, legal protection from discrimination in the member states. The Secretary General has called for this. Probably all of your countries have received recommendations in this regard in the Universal Periodic Review and in Treaty Body Review. Our view is that strengthened protection from discrimination, legal protection, benefits everyone. So we're working on that. The guide is in English now. It has been own initiative translated into Japanese, Portuguese, and Korean. So there are national initiatives to translate into languages coming not from the UN, but just from places that have found it useful. We will roll out the official translations during the next 18 months. So French, Spanish, Arabic, Russian and Chinese. Coming imminently this year is going to be Spanish, Russian, and French. First half of next year is Chinese and Arabic. We also have, and this was a request of consultations in a group of people of African descent from the MENA region, as well as from the Africa region, a project going on to try and work on vulgarisation, namely taking the materials and bringing them into languages that are more relevant and through communication modes that are more relevant for community level. We were told that the language and the thinking needs to be sort of made, more relevant for community level. There are 3 universities involved in that effort, and we will be working on that in the next years. As I said, any questions can be directed really to any of my colleagues, and we're happy to stand by. But if you think you have a good context for the development of anti-discrimination law at national level, please do reach out. We are very interested in connecting with any initiative in good faith to try and strengthen the legal regime. Over. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claude. I come to you. Did the delegate from Japan, did you want to take the... No, it's okay. Sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Quickly, I just want to raise the question maybe to Professor Watts. I appreciate that you raise all these recommendations and conclusions. I just want to see whether your university have any connection with other universities in Asia Pacific, including China. Maybe we can, among the university networks, we can do something together. And I think data collection is important, but analysis and also the usage is also important, right? Because if you just collect it and store it, but you didn't analyze that's not good. And I think that the support from member states, from other donors to this kind of research is important. I agree, and I think we call on member states to do more, especially those influencing countries, to support this kind of meaningful research. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Davis?
Just want to thank you for your fantastic presentation, Professor Watts. And I wanted to ask a question in relation to the Indigenous cultural intellectual property that you're talking about, because First Nations Australians have this policy that exists, and have you considered modelling something for people of African descent on that, which has very strict ethical guidelines about the usage? And we do have a reconciliation action plan, closing the gap, policies, action plans. And I think, given that there is that evident kinship with people of African descent, the Pacific First Nations people, there's scope there to work better together across protecting our rights, our cultural intellectual property. So I think it's a statement rather than a question, but maybe that's a consideration that we can come together and start working on with the Indigenous Peoples Organisation, which is a grassroots representative in Sydney, and Australian South Sea Islanders, Port Jackson, potentially, creating those strong networks, because the commonality here is oppression, slavery, and so many other things for people of colour, for black people, as you're stating. Thank you.
Very interesting. Thank you very much for those contributions in the room. I believe we have Jeffrey Omar online who wished to take the floor.
Hello? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, good morning, everyone. Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Moderator, and everyone who's there. I'm actually in New York City. My name is Jeffrey Omar Patrick. I go by Jeffrey Omar. I'm the health chair for the NAACP. I'm also a doctoral candidate at Columbia University studying a cure for discrimination. Now, in my research, I'm coming across a question that I think I need to get some answers to, of course. And I wanted to ask some of the panelists, what are their thoughts about what is the only prominent racist force that we encounter in our modern time? What would they think that is? And more importantly, when it comes to the way that AI and these algorithms that were spoken about, what is it that we're going to do in order to ensure that we have a less discriminative future? In other words, what does humankind's furthest future look like to each and every one of us here in this panel this afternoon, not only in Asia and not only in the Pacific, but in our entire world? So if anyone could help me, just, if you need clarity on the question, just let me know. But I'm trying to figure out, how is it that we can move past discrimination? And is it possible?
Great. Thank you, Jeffrey. We'll do our best to address that, and I'll give
Jeffrey
the floor
Omar.
also to Daisy online.
Thank you so much for giving me the space and time to raise this question. My question is to MC Watts, and actually to the entire panel or anyone in the room who can speak to the question that I wish to respectfully raise. My name is Daisy. I'm on the Central Coast in Australia, and I'm a person of African descent that came here and has lived in Australia for 34 years. Similar to the question raised in New York, the impact of racism or violence, of the not so positive contributions of different cultures coming together has created mistrust. And I picked up on the issue pointed out by Ms. Watts about the Tuskegee situation, where people were infected with syphilis without their consent, and the trauma that she has seen firsthand by visiting the jails in Australia, and by just listening to people's issues of concern. My question is, and this is asked in a spirit of wishing to find out how to move forward. The simple question that I wish to raise is, how can we eliminate or minimize trauma, ensure safety and security, and reinstate trust when there's been so much heinous atrocities committed, and when people prefer to silence rather than bring forth these things out into the open for discussion so that we can move forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Daisy. We will come back to that very big forward-looking question, but I think there was one other question in the text, in the chat box, if my colleagues could perhaps read that.
Yes, with pleasure. So we have one question from June Levis from the International League for People of African Descent Coalition, who is raising the importance of including the history of Africans and Black history in school curricula, and is asking specifically Australia, but probably applies to other countries, what can be done to make sure that this is appropriately reflected in school curricula.
Can I speak? Is that possible?
So are you June Levis? Yes, of course you can take.
Okay,
take the
sorry,
floor.
thank you. Thank you. I was doing it in the time limit, and I just made it very brief. And the reason I put it towards Australia, and thank you everybody for giving me the time to speak. It's been amazing listening to everybody's contribution. This is for Australia. I'm trying to do some fact finding, and I know the African enslaved were sent from England to the Australian state. Can somebody please tell me if you still have the skulls and the bones of the African enslaved that were sent from the UK colonies to Australia? I will put the information in the chat. It's quite long and quite winded. And there's a scheme to send back the bodies, send back the remains, return them. It's part of the UNESCO slave project. It's going on here, you know, with the Benin bronzes and other things going back. And I'm just looking into that. And I've come across a few incidences where Australia has them in the museums. I'm happy to put all that information in the chat. I just wish to know, is there a scheme for them to be returned to the African continent? And if somebody can give me the information, please. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much for that, June. And I think we'll stop there, take some responses, and then of course others may want to contribute further. So just to recap, we had questions on the role of youth in terms of both data, but also participation and representation. I think we had two interesting comments on what can be adapted from First Nations experiences and Indigenous communities, but also I think, without implying too much, from other communities, for instance, the communities of Chinese descent, and what's been done in terms of history and recovery and representation of other descent or diaspora communities. The opportunities for other university collaboration and networking, we've heard a little bit from UNESCO about some of the interregional possibilities. The question also of more secondary school level or even primary school level education and curricula from June. But then also these other bigger questions to the room from Jeffrey in terms of what are really the biggest vectors of racism in the region, and what accelerators are there now with artificial intelligence and digital technologies. We have then also the question of how to overcome historical trauma and distrust, and perhaps that also relates to the last comment about the recovery of remains, the return of artifacts, and what can be done to rebuild trust as a necessary element in taking forward this agenda. So they're very, very interesting questions, and I perhaps will ask the two panelists to respond as they see fit or most relevant to their work. But equally, I think some of the questions are bigger and addressed to all of us in the room or online, and if there are other contributions people would like to make, that would be very welcome. So perhaps I'll turn first to Professor Watts.
Thank you so much, and I think I've got about 9 questions here, so I'm going to go through them academic style systematically. I'm going to start with the first question that you asked about data for migrants, the participation by youth, and how have you been part of this process? In fact, I must start by saying that there is significant positive contribution of African migrants in Australia, but also Australasia and the Pacific. That must not be lost. I am an example of a skilled migrant, even though I would say I'm the first Black woman in the history of my institution that started as a mining school 150 years ago before amalgamating to become a university. I'm the first Black woman in the professorate, and that I'm probably one of the handful in the country. But there are other people who are excelling in areas of health, education, and other works of life. Go to our mining sites. I would say primarily the Zimbabweans and others run that. In terms of our youth, I think a lot is who you are, you call youth. And when we look at the African Union definition, it's normally people from the age of about 18 to 35. The definition of youth does vary, but I think there's a significant presence and their contribution, especially in the areas of arts, in the areas of sports, the visibility of, for example, our South Sudanese communities in basketball, in Australian football, in education, the presence of the Nigerian, Ghanaian, Cameroonian communities in the areas of health and education. It's really interesting. Remember, I highlighted the different waves of migrants and the different types of migrants. Again, when you look up within those groups, there is a lot of diversity, but there's contribution, particularly for the young people. And I think one of the key areas is in the areas of law. I think the youth are excelling in those areas. Then the other question was in terms of guides and policies, but also guides and policies. And I must say, yes, there are lots of policies out there when it comes to anti-discrimination. But my call and my suggestion would be that those laws and policies must be rectified and implemented, but also action must be taken. Because until we see action, we have got all the policies that you can think of, and we must rectify those policies. Then somebody mentioned languages. And all the languages that were named, none of them was African. So it's really important in the work that you are doing. I would like to see, for example, Swahili, that is a regional language, included. I would like to see, for example, Somali is a regional language. Millions of people speak it. And then when you go across West Africa, there is something like the Yoruba language, the Edo languages. These are significant regional languages. So we must start thinking about including African languages if we really want to empower our people. Then from Japan, you talk about connections with universities. And yes, my university has got significant connections with universities across the Asia Pacific, Europe, the Americas, and recently, with me, there is presence as well in Africa. So we must lead, not because sometimes people don't know, but people need people to lead that work. You know, people are going to drag their feet, etc., but you have to be very, very purposeful, but you also have to be a visionary in order to make them see the value of what we have on the continent. Unfortunately, media representation of people of African descent and what actually happens on the African continent doesn't always help. So people are unsure. So people like myself and all of you in this room have therefore got that responsibility to be ambassadors of the continent, regardless of where you are, regardless of who you are. So yes, there are contributions, and I'm more than happy to connect with you in terms of partnerships. My other hat is being Director of Industry Cooperation for the Institute of Health and Wellbeing at the university. Then, Madam Davis, thank you so much for your comment. I hope I did the presentation justice. 15 to 20 minutes is not a lot of time, but we have to give a very good detailed summary. You asked about indigenous knowledge and how this is being utilized. Well, my university, for example, we have got the first National Reconciliation Center in Australia, and that was officially opened, I think, 2022, so we should be in the third year. And last year, when there was the referendum on the voice to parliament for the indigenous people, Federation University was very, very active, and people like myself, for example, made contributions in different ways. But when you think that 6 million people in Australia voted for the voice, but yet the voice was voted down, it really tells you where we are in terms of inclusion for our First Nation people. So thank you for a very important and very pertinent question. Then online, we had Mr. Jeffrey Omar, the health chair from New York. You talked about thoughts on prominent races that encounter in our, thoughts on prominent racist force that we encounter in our time. And you also talked about AI and algorithms and what does humankind's future look like. That's a very complex question, but what I can say to that is that racism exists in different forms. And we can talk about conscious and unconscious bias, and we can stay here all day talking about those two. However, it is about, do people acknowledge that there is this gap, and do people acknowledge that it is there? But we also have to think about the structures of racism built on colonialism, on imperialism, and these structures for generations have benefited some groups. So it is difficult to dismantle them. We must know that we are not going to dismantle racism in a generation or two, but we must have laws and must be working and raising awareness and educating people about the negativity and the impact, especially on the health of people, because your health is your wealth. So it's really important. In terms of AI and algorithms, I guess there is a growing body of research in terms of AI and Black people. And what has happened now is that quite a significant contingency of Black people are now coding and ensuring that they're part of that coding process. And as highlighted in my statement, we cannot be passive consumers. We must be active participants. And I think when it comes to AI and the future, nobody really knows what is going to happen because we are all in it together. But we must be active. We must have people who are not only consuming data, they must be creating data, but we also be part of the policy making process, because if we don't participate and help to shape policies, policies are going to be made that are going to affect us. So we must be active in that process. Then Ms. Daisy, online, you talked about, she's been in Australia for some 34 years, which is quite impressive, and the impact of racism in Australia. And your question was, how can we eliminate suspicion and instill trust in research? And of course, you're talking here about the historical trauma that people have faced over the years. I think to build trust is really by willingly not only having policies in place, but engaging the respective communities, listening to them, and being part and bringing them to be part of whatever process. We should not, if you sit around any table and decisions are being made about people and they're not represented around that table, then that is suspicion and people are going to be suspicious. And I think one of the things I did highlight was people are much more likely to accept decisions that they are a part of the process. Hence, if we want to eliminate distrust, we need to bring the people from the outset and make them to be central. And also, we have to use the Afrocentric lens in order to ensure that the issues that are being discussed, the decisions that are being made, that these people are part of not just the process, they're also part of the solution. That solution has to come from us, and governments must make efforts to ensure that this happened. And I think this morning, one of the things I did say was that visible representation in significant senior positions around all the countries or wherever you are. I cannot tell you how many people have done their PhDs because I literally, I don't know whether I back them, but they do it because it's like, well, you make us want to do it because they've put it off for so long, but then they hear a voice like mine, tap them on the shoulder and say, I think you should be doing this. Most often than not, they listen. So we need to have those voices. We need to have that visibility. Then in terms of fact-finding about scores of Africans to return them, and that was from Ms. June, and also regarding the history of Africans in school curriculums in Australia. When you talk about school curriculums, not only in Australia, but anywhere, I think we can turn around and look at what is going on in America. And I think the biggest challenge is when you've benefited from a structure for so long, and we have got a history that has been very whitewashed, and who wins the war writes the history. But the books that most people were educated with, those books were written for a particular purpose. So in terms of inclusion of African histories in curriculums, unfortunately, I think that is one of the challenges that we continue to face. And I think one of the big things that we have in Australia is that we are yet to have one single Institute of African Studies. And that is not people coming together as a small group, doing some work in mining, doing some business course. This is about institutes that are there to teach African history, to teach African literature, to teach, and they are not side products. For example, there are universities, I can tell you, it's like our focus is European history. However, because we have this person, you can teach some whatever on American history or African history. No, we're talking about institutes that are created and funded specifically and led by people of the Afro descendants to do that work. So I think it's a very important question. It is beyond me to answer in this forum, but it is something that I think collectively we need to continue to advocate for. And then in relation to returning the skulls of people who arrived in Australia during the first fleet, I think that's something that most people had not realized, that Africans were on the first fleet since the first ships landed on the shores of Australia. And I know that descendants of some of those people are in the North Shores of Sydney, and I met somebody not too long ago in Victoria who is a descendant of one of those true Rotary. So these are facts, but I am not a historian. I am a health academic advocate and policy maker. So it is something that I think it would be good to engage the historians, and this is where having places like the institutes that focus on African stories and histories makes sense, because you will have a diversity of experts to help lead some of this work, because this is valid, it is important, it is going to serve our nation. So I just want to say thank you, and I hope I addressed all the questions put forward.
Thank you for such a systematic response and capturing so many issues. I'll now give the floor last to Ms. Anne Moreau for any final words. We are a little bit to the end of our time, but we'd very much like to hear from you one more time. No, we can't hear you yet. No. There's no sound. No, I think you're mute, actually. I think if you check your mute button. There. Can you speak? Any sound? No. Unfortunately, we're not getting sound. No, I'm not sure if we will be able to solve this in the time, but I know that Lynn Moreau shared her email address earlier at the end of her presentation, and I'm sure would be happy to hear from you or follow up on any question. One last try? No, it seems it's failed us. But please do be in contact with our colleague from UNESCO around the Memory of the World project, the recovery of remains, some of the issues raised. I think that really brings us to the end. Sara has joined us in place of Aziz, but I'd just like to thank all of you very much, our panelists, especially Professor Watt and Ms. Anne Moreau, for such excellent inputs to the meeting, and also the really interesting questions that came from the floor. So thank you very much, and thank you to the Secretariat and all the colleagues who've been involved to organise the meeting. Sarah?
Thank you, Rory. Thanks so much for the excellent moderation. And I join you also in thanking the panelists and congratulating our distinguished panelists for their presentations. And thank you to state representatives and to the meeting participants for your contributions and your participation as well.